everyone. Welcome to the very first lecture of HIS 155, History of the Jewish People 1. This is a fascinating course. It's a survey course that will be the first of two that cover all of Jewish history from the beginnings of the diaspora in the first century to the present day. Today's topic is what is Jewish history? It's just an introductory lecture, but I hope you'll find it interesting. Let's have a look at the Prezi right now. Okay, so here we begin. The topic is what is Jewish history? Let's have a look at the very first slide. Many people wonder, what exactly are we doing when we're studying history? I mean, why do we need to have so many historians? Isn't this the kind of thing where, I can just read one book and I'll be done? I will know the history, just like, for example, I might know Euclidean math, or I might know grade 8 geometry or something like that. Why do we have to go on and on and on? Why are there so many revisions to history? I mean, what are these things for? Can't we just start with the basic information, get it right, and move on? So that's a very common thought, specifically when you want to buy your history textbooks and you see that they're a lot more expensive to buy the 5th edition than it is the 4th edition. But part of the reason is because certainly there is such a thing as bad history. So there are people who distort history, who don't have enough facts, who tell the story wrong, things like that. And one of the major advances in the modern production of historical analysis was occasioned by the thought of Leopold von Ranke, who's shown here on the right. I'll give you a close-up. One of his most famous quotes is this phrase, wie es eigentlich gewesen war, which means the way it actually was, meaning we're going to try and get history right. Let's just get all the facts, like a videotape or something, and we will just play it, and then we'll have the actual history. This is the way he actually was, von Ranke, and you can see he's pretty relaxed. He seems like he knows what he's doing. He's got a big, thick history book, which perhaps he assumed would be the last history book that would ever be written, because once you write it the way it actually was, what else is there to say, right? Well, there's some problems with this model, and we have advanced in our discipline of history over the last couple hundred years. One element, though, he definitely had right, and that is the notion that it's certainly wrong to distort history, to try and airbrush out those offending elements, or actually airbrush, I'm dating myself with that phrase, to Photoshop out offending elements. Here, for example, is a photograph of a very important figure in British history, Oliver Cromwell, and he was famous for demanding that portraits of him, official portraits, be done with quote-unquote warts and all. And as you can see, he had a rather prominent wart right up here on his forehead, and he insisted that when an official portrait is done of him, it be done without removing any of these offending items. So history should be like that too, right? We should not remove the warts of history. We should try to portray all of the negative aspects of history as well. In fact, as we see from his death mask, this is another bizarre thing they used to do in the 17th and 18th centuries. They used to take like wax molds of people's faces immediately after they died, and then they would make them into plaster casts, which would be sold and distributed. It was a popular kind of item, but it's valuable for historians because here is the death mask of Oliver Cromwell, and as you can see, yes, there it is, the wart, you can't miss it. We have, in fact, an accurate rendition of history. But on another level, that is missing the point about what history actually does. Consider this image, for example. This is an official portrait of Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, or one of the French kings from the 17th and early 18th century. Now, this portrait is certainly idealized. I mean, it's done by an artist. If there were any warts on his face, he would certainly have removed them here and things like that. So you can see on the level of, what are we looking at? There is a lack of verisimilitude. Well, that is a really good word. A lack of accuracy, perhaps, in the photograph-like reproduction of his likeness. But at the same time, I think this image says a lot more about who he was. I mean, check out the clothes. Those are just so wild. He's got this rather racy slit up his skirt, or maybe that's a robe. The hose are really, quite impressive. They go with the heels, I think. And that wig that he's wearing, I mean, this says something about Louis XIV that you would not get in a photograph. This talks about his view of himself as a larger-than-life figure, someone with power. You see the sword sticking out underneath, and at the same time a sense of style. It's rather cumbersome. Can you imagine walking around in that kind of outfit? That's hard to imagine. But it says more about Louis XIV in this artistic representation than you would get in a simple photograph. And if you find that maybe a little bit of a stretch, check out this image. Here you see that, once again, he has definitely a pronounced penchant for skirts. But the way he views himself here is he's somehow, at the head of battle. He's carrying some kind of scroll that I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's hard not to miss the winged victory there, placing a laurel crown on his head, indicating that he's really, victorious in every way, and she's got the sun banner above him. And this is certainly nowhere near reality on one level, but on another level, it says a lot more about what the reign of Louis XIV must have been like. So history, on one hand, it is very much like mathematics or a physical science like biology, physics, things like that. But on the other hand, it's much closer to poetry. It's one of the humanities. It's one of those areas in which the freedom of human expression is extremely important for understanding history. Okay? So that's the first point, that we should understand that history is, on the one hand, an attempt to capture the realities and the photograph-like accuracy of some kind of reproduction of the past, and that's really important. We can't make up facts. The facts have to be real. But on the other hand, history also involves a certain amount of poetic license in the sense that we've got way too many facts. We've got an abundance of facts. Like, for example, does it matter what shoe size Louis XIV wore? It does if we want to try and identify if a particular pair of heels were his or not. But does it really matter for the larger history? No. It is accurate, but on the other hand, in terms of poetic license, it just doesn't matter for history. And on the other hand, if he viewed himself in an extremely grandiose fashion, there's no way to actually photograph that, but it can be captured in art. So historians do the same kind of thing. Historians work with facts, and they also have to deal in the world of interpretation, literary analysis, as it were, of the timeline of history. That's one kind of general thing that speaks to a deeper sense of what von Ranke meant when he said the way it actually was. So let's go on to the second point, very important, which deals with the social function of history. And we're going to tie that specifically to Jewish history. So what do we mean by the social function of history? Well, basically, history has to do something. History has to somehow meet a need in our intellectual and even our physical lives. What exactly is that need? Well, first of all, let's note that the word story is embedded in the word history, and that's because history provides a narrative. Narrative is a really important term here. Narrative is kind of like the logical sequencing of events, the logical sequencing of facts to tell a coherent story. In other words, a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. History is quite chaotic. There's a zillion things happening every single day, but somehow you have to pick out from those zillion data points those elements that come together to form a coherent story. Like, for example, if you were to tell the story of your life, if you were to tell every single detail, it would literally take you as long as you have been living, and then some, perhaps, to describe all of it. So naturally, what you would do is you would select those data points that are especially important, like when you were born, where you were born, who your parents were, key moments in your childhood, things like that come together, and that makes the story of your life. So history is the same kind of thing. History has to provide a narrative. Now, what does this narrative do? Narratives typically affirm victories and rationalize defeats, to put it in kind of a military metaphor. In other words, when we're talking about our life story, if let's say we have a positive, healthy vision of ourselves, then when we achieve things in our life, we're going to play those things up and we're going to understand them as the result of our hard work and effort and things like that. But on the other hand, when we have setbacks, our life story is going to kind of explain why those setbacks happened and give us a chance to try and move on in our lives, because we can kind of shelve them away in a manner that allows us to consider the meaning of our life as a coherent whole. That's why history is often written by the victors. So if you think about history as wars between countries, for example, the winners will invariably portray their side in a battle as just, and perhaps defending the honor of religion and state and power and things like that. No one's going to say we attacked the other country because we liked their natural resources and we wanted to steal them. They'll always affirm the victories and rationalize the defeats. So historians are employed, sometimes literally, to try and write histories that defend a particular agenda. Like, let me tell you something a little bit about myself. When I was a young historian back in the 1990s, or 1980s really, and early 90s, where the internet was just being born. I mean, I remember being one of the first people in the graduate school to start using email. It was really bizarre. We thought it was so amazing. But at any rate, when I was a young historian, we had these things called card catalogs, where if you wanted to find a book in the library, they had these massive wooden filing cabinets with these little tiny drawers, and you would have to pull them out, and they were filled with index cards. I'm not kidding you, little paper index cards, and each book was listed on the index card, and you had to kind of like rifle through them all in alphabetical order, you hope, because if one was out of place, you might never ever find it again. And once you found that index card, you'd write down the call number, and you'd go up to the stacks and you would find that specific book. And if the book wasn't in your library, then you had to go to the librarian and you had to order it through interlibrary loan. And if it was in a library that didn't have interlibrary loan, then you had to travel to that library, perhaps in another country. And if that book was in another language, then you had to learn that language. And it was like such an incredibly difficult amount of effort that as young historians, we used to get points just for finding the facts. I mean, just by going through all that effort to locate the facts, that was worth something. Nowadays, you guys have it so much easier on the one hand because you want a fact in any language, at any time, at any place, you just hit your keyboard or you whip out your smartphone and you've got it right there. That's amazing. So finding facts for you guys is no problem, unlike, my generation. But what is a serious problem for you, which was not as serious for us, and I'm not going to get into it today, but serious problem for you is figuring out which facts are useful, which facts are relevant. Filtering through this universe of facts to get the right ones, that's the task that you guys have to deal with. And I don't envy you. So here it is. It's like the internet. Finding the facts, not so important as interpreting them. That's a really important thing that we have to understand in terms of well, it's not connected to the social function of history, but let's just go anyways. History is really messy. There's so many incongruent data points that interfere with the simple narratives, meaning here you are trying to tell the story of your life as a heroic struggle towards, some lofty goal, and then you've got these data points of all the times that you were lazy and you didn't try hard enough and you failed as a result. So what do you do with those incongruent data points? You have to try and work with them. One last really important thing: when you're not sure why anything happened in history, and this is related to this social function here, I'm going to give you what I like to call, because it gives me great pleasure, the Abramson rule of history. And this is something that my students know will eventually show up on an exam somewhere. The Abramson rule of history is as follows. If you're not sure why something happened, it's probably because of money. Money is really crucial to the flow of history, the writing of history, the unfolding of history, as we shall see multiple times through this course. So let's move on now to ask the question, what is Jewish history? So if we understand this concept of, there's way too many data points and we have to kind of sift through them to get the basic idea, we're going to come up with this kind of statement, this kind of formulation of Jewish history. They tried to kill us, We survived. Let's eat. I mean, you look at our holidays, Passover, Hanukkah, all kinds of things like that. And, typically this is the sort of narrative that we have. Here we are, if I can put it in another way, we're kind of like an embattled minority, unfairly attacked by oppressive regimes. We somehow survive miraculously, and now we celebrate our survival. That's a really basic, what they call an elevator pitch to Jewish history. That's the narrative that is so often used to try to put together those specific data points to create a coherent narrative. But is it really the best? Well, there are some aspects of this narrative which are very useful. For example, if our object in creating this narrative is to try to reinforce our integrity as a people, in the sense that, to avoid assimilation, to kind of understand why suffering happens and so on, then it actually works fantastically well, because no matter how much the Jewish people are persecuted, by returning to this particular historical narrative, it helps justify and helps us understand the nature of this suffering. It ironically reinforces our belief in the traditional values of this narrative, which includes typically belief in God, the chosenness of the Jewish people, the eventual redemption through the Messiah. All these kinds of things fit together really well in this narrative. Now, there are other narratives that we could choose from, and in fact, many other historians do, as we shall see shortly. But when we work with this basic, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat narrative, we see it echoing throughout Jewish history. For example, this very early passage in the Gemara, in the tractate Shabbat of the Talmud, there is a discussion of an old historical work called Megillat Ta'anit, or Megillas Taanis, which is basically a record, kind of a chronology, of all the terrible things that happened to the Jews in ancient times, along with the denouement, how they turned out, and it's recorded as a scroll of fasts. That's the translation of Megillat Ta'anit, because on those days when terrible things happened or nearly happened, these would be fast days in the Jewish history. So the rabbis ask in the Talmud, already we're talking 1700 odd years ago, they ask, so who wrote this Megillat Ta'anit? Who wrote this scroll of fasts? So Hananiah ben Chezkiah and his circle are credited with it. Why? Because they loved troubles. They loved analyzing these and working with them and recording them and so on. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel writes, so you know what? We love troubles too, which is an ironic statement, but I think it fits into this narrative notion of Jewish history. But what can we do? If we were to record them, we are not up to the task, meaning there are just way too many of these troubles to really put them down. It's overwhelming. And in fact, those of us who lived through the 20th century, particularly those of us who are older and remember the middle of the 20th century, it's just absolutely excruciating to think about the kind of troubles that Jewish people have gone through. But this kind of narrative has its difficulties. For example, what about Jewish successes? How do they fit into this narrative, which does not always emphasize those areas where Jews excelled? And what do we do about Jewish culpability? For example, when Jews do something wrong, how do we integrate that into the oppressed minority, unfairly persecuted? How do we understand those events? Did they happen, for example? And thirdly, how do we deal with the symbiosis with non-Jewish culture? How do we deal with the fact that, I'm speaking to you in English, a non-Jewish language, using, modern tools of history, which were primarily invented by non-Jews. How do we, and we can go on and on with, what we wear and what we listen to and what we eat, all these things are the result of symbiotic or co-living relationships with non-Jewish cultures. How does that fit into this overall narrative? Sometimes these are difficult questions to answer. But let's have a look at a couple of Jewish historians and what they've done. I should say, in this frame that you're looking at now, there's only one Jewish historian. On the left is Heinrich Gretz, the first great encyclopedic Judaic historian. And what I mean by that is, we had a lot of people, really from Megillas Tainus and even earlier, we had a lot of Jews who recorded historical events, but more in a kind of a martyrologies. They're trying to like list the terrible things that happened, kind of like in a chronological format. And we've got quite a few of those going back for a couple thousand years. But it was only in the 19th century that Jews really got into the writing of history in a critical fashion, adopting the kind of techniques that von Ranke was promoting. He was a student of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch and was a master of many languages, and he wrote this massive 6-volume history of the Jews. That's how it appears in English in 6 volumes, which articulated the kind of narrative that I have already described. And it was an amazing hit for Jews because here was in one massive work the whole panoply of Jewish events all recorded together, and it told a coherent narrative, and it made Jews feel really proud about being Jewish, which was extremely significant for the social function of 19th century Germany, where Jews were trying to gain access to larger non-Jewish culture. They were trying to achieve emancipation, and as a result, they were demonstrating to themselves and to the larger world that they were worthy of equality and citizenship. And we will explore this topic, God willing, when we get to History 156. However, Gretz's work was not appreciated by all. On the right, you see a German historian, not Jewish, named Heinrich von Treitschke, who was roughly the same generation as Gretz, and he criticized Gretz bitterly. And he coined a phrase, which you see at the bottom of your screen, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, which means the Jews are our misfortune. He felt that Gretz was unnecessarily laudatory of Jewish activities, and that his narrative was too simplistic, and that the Jews were in fact rather nefarious agents in world history, constantly bringing down healthy societies and reducing them to rubble. And he felt that the Jews should be denied citizenship, should be denied equal rights, and in fact should maybe be even chased out of the country. When we look into his heart of hearts, let's zoom in here, we see that his slogans were really influential on 20th century history. This is a picture of Nazis looking at a bulletin board put up by a really nasty anti-Semitic propaganda rag called Der Stürmer, the Stormtrooper, edited by Julius Streicher. At the top it reads, Mit dem Stürmer gegen Juda, with the Stormtrooper magazine against Judaism. And then underneath you can see they're reading pages from that magazine. You can see the caricature of a Jew on the left there. And the phrase on the top is von Treitschke's famous phrase, Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. We've got to get rid of them. So here you have two very oppositional models as to what Jewish history means. On the one hand, you have Gretz, who promotes this heroic aspect of a peaceful, peace-loving minority, and you have, on the other hand, the von Treitschke model, which shows the Jews as agents of decay and desolation in every society they live. So how do we sort through these two things? Basically through something called historiography. This is really important for more advanced history students, but I'm going to give you just a 2-minute description of this right now. So historiography, translated, is the writing of history. Not what is history, but how is history made. And it takes into account all of the things we've discussed so far, including the kinds of narratives that are constructed, the social function that the history is applied to try and tease out, what is wrong with this history and how can we improve it. The kind of problems that historiographers have to deal with, or historians who study historiography have to deal with, are the following. For example, source bias. This includes the bias of the author, but also the bias of the sources that he or she goes to make that history. For example, one of the great historians of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, did not read Hebrew or Yiddish. So he wrote a fantastic, amazing, multi-volume history of the Holocaust called The Destruction of the European Jews. which was an incredibly useful work. But because he was not able to access traditional Jewish languages, he didn't have enough material on, modern historians criticized his work because he didn't have enough material on what the Jews thought about what was happening to them. Memoir literature and newspapers and diaries and things like that. So his history, which was again extremely valuable, but it presented a lot of his analysis from the perspective of the Nazis understanding the bureaucracy of murder. So the sources that a historian turns to are really significant for creating the final document. Propaganda is the document, the final book of history, let's say, trying to push an agenda. So every book pushes an agenda. That's really another way of saying narrative. But is it doing so in an unfair way by omitting those key data points, or by downplaying them, or by taking them out of context, and so on? And finally, very common in Jewish historiography, hagiography. This refers to the writing of legends. So for example, if you're writing about some great rabbi, and he had failures in his life, maybe even character failures, how do you write about those things? Is it important to write about those things? How does it deal with halacha, hilchas lashon hara, things like that? So good hagiography omits all those things, but that's also bad history, because we want to understand wie es eigentlich gewesen war, like von Ranke said. Just to tell you how the story keeps going, for example, Gretz is not the end of Jewish history as we understand it. Much more has been written in the century following his death, and into the 21st century we show no signs of slowing down. Shimon Dubno here, another great encyclopedic historian, writing a 10-volume history of the Jews, which is also translated into English in a 5-volume edition. He criticized Gretz for his excessively Prussian attitude towards Jewry, in which he said that the Eastern European Jews were hopelessly backward and superstitious. He took a very, very dim view of Kabbalah, of the Hasidic movement, and so on. Dubno, living in the Russian Empire, emphasized these as, true expressions of the Jewish spirit, of the folk culture, and so on. And then later in the 20th century, the great American historian, originally born in Europe, Salo Baron, in his magisterial, I think it's 16-volume work, Social and Religious History of the Jews, he takes issue with what he calls the lachrymose vision of Jewish history. Lachrymose meaning tearful. That he says, why are we always emphasizing all these persecutions? Can't we just get off the persecution thing and talk about Jews as part of the larger social, religious, economic, political elements of a society as a whole? So this is just a couple of little tidbits to give you a sense of how historians disagree with each other in terms of historiography, and as a result they create very different histories as a whole. Okay, last slide. What's in this course? So basically we're going to study the Jewish diaspora, meaning the time that the Jews spent out of their country from the destruction of the temples in the 1st century all the way up to the present day. Of course, the last part of the second element of this course will deal with modern Israel, but I'll get to that when we get to next semester. In this semester, we're going to focus on the Roman-Jewish wars to the Spanish expulsion. And then next semester, we'll begin with the Spanish expulsion and go up to the present day. Okay, great. I hope you enjoyed this short lecture, and I hope you'll think about it. Your task now is to do the reading, which is posted there on your blackboard, and then take the self-test to make sure that you understand all the things that we've talked about today, and then move on, succeed, and do great. Okay? Thanks very much for listening.